Picture this. It's November 14th, 1940. The sky over Britain is pitch black, a canvas of impenetrable darkness. Through that darkness, 500 German bombers are screaming towards a sleeping city, flying with a terrifying pinpoint precision that defies logic. They aren't relying on sight, they're guided by something invisible, a revolutionary new technology that no one in Britain knows how to stop. Hitler's secret weapon. While the military scrambles, completely blind to the threat, one 8-year-old physicist, a man most generals had never heard of, tells his bosses the impossible. I can see them. They called him crazy. They laughed at his theories. But what Dr. Reginald Victor Jones discovered didn't just save thousands of lives. It exposed a secret so profound it could have rewritten the end of the war. But let's be clear. This isn't just a story about technology. It's about the terrible price of knowing a secret and the impossible choices that come with it. Our story begins a year earlier, on a cold November evening in 1939. In a cramped office at the Air Ministry in London, smelling of stale pipe tobacco and old paper, Dr. R.V. Jones was staring at a piece of paper that made his blood run cold. Just weeks into his new job as a scientific intelligence officer, the young physicist was tasked with a simple, yet impossibly vast mission. Figure out what the Germans were planning in their labs. Most of what he saw was routine. But this was different. It was a decoded German transmission, filled with cryptic jargon, words like X-Gerät, the X device, and references to beams and coordinates leaped off the page. It described a targeting system more advanced than anything the British possessed, or even thought possible. Jones read the message again, then a third time, a knot tightening in his stomach. If he was reading this right, the Germans had found a way to surgically remove British cities from the map, even on the darkest, stormiest nights. They had weaponized the invisible, but when he brought his fears to his superiors, he was met with a wall of disbelief. In a meeting room thick with cigar smoke, surrounded by men whose uniforms were adorned with medals from a previous war, his theories were dismissed out of hand. Air Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, a man whose presence filled any room, scoffed openly. Radio beams guiding bombers? Preposterous, Dr. Jones. He waved a dismissive hand. The curvature of the Earth alone renders such a system useless. You're a physicist, you should know that. You are wasting our time with science fiction. The other officers nodded in agreement. They were soldiers, men of steel and action, not theoretical science. They understood planes and bombs, not invisible waves in the air. To them, this young, unassuming academic was an outsider, a boffin who didn't understand the realities of war. The meeting was over before it truly began. Jones left the room feeling humiliated, the condescending laughter of the generals echoing in his ears, but he couldn't let it go. The feeling in his gut, the cold logic of the data, wouldn't allow it. For the next 3 weeks, Jones became a ghost, haunting the archives and intelligence depots, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of dread. He worked relentlessly, piecing together a puzzle that no one else could see. The first piece was a German bomber that had crashed in the English countryside. RAF mechanics, stripping the wreckage, found a tangle of wires and radio equipment they couldn't identify. It was unusual, overly complex. Jones got the reports and saw a connection. The second piece came from the code breakers at Bletchley Park. They were intercepting Luftwaffe communications that were peppered with strange code names, like Knickerbein, which translates to crooked leg. The chatter was meaningless to the military analysts, but to Jones, it hinted at a system of guidance. The final piece came from the pilots of the Royal Air Force. Some reported hearing strange, ghostly radio signals while on patrol over Germany, a steady, high-pitched tone that seemed to be coming from a single direction. Late one night, his office floor buried in documents, Jones spread everything out. Photographs of the strange radio gear, technical diagrams he'd drawn from memory, signal reports from the pilots, the decoded messages. It was a chaotic mess of seemingly unrelated facts, but slowly, a terrifying picture began to emerge. The British military believed its cities were safe at night, protected by the darkness and the weather. But what if that protection was now an illusion? What if the Germans could see in the dark? He grabbed the telephone, his hand shaking slightly, and dialed his assistant, a brilliant young scientist named Charles Frank. "Charles, get back here. I don't care what time it is." There was a pause. "I think I've figured it out. And if I'm right, God help us." An hour later, the two men stood over the desk, the scattered papers now arranged in a clear order. Jones, pointing with a pencil, laid out his theory. "What if," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "they're not using just one beam? What if they're using two? Intersecting radio beams?" He grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and began to sketch furiously. Imagine a bomber flies along one beam, like it's a railroad track in the sky. It's perfectly straight. The pilot doesn't need to see a thing. He just listens to a tone in his headset. Then, when his instruments detect a second beam crossing the first, right over the target, that's the signal. That's when they drop the bombs. Charles Frank stared at the simple, elegant diagram. He leaned back, the color draining from his face. "Reggie, that's brilliant." He paused, looking Jones in the eye. "Terrifyingly brilliant. But is it even possible?" "I think it is," Jones replied quietly, his voice heavy with certainty. "And I think they're doing it already." If Jones was right, Hitler was holding a dagger to the heart of Britain, ready to strike with devastating precision. And the only thing standing in the way was a 28-year-old physicist with a crazy theory about invisible beams, a theory that, so far, almost no one in power believed. His lonely, invisible war was just beginning. The very next morning, armed with his terrifying new certainty, Jones requested an emergency meeting with the highest levels of British military and scientific leadership. He was granted 15 minutes. 15 minutes to convince a room of powerful, skeptical men that an invisible threat was not just real, but aimed directly at them. It was a classic David versus Goliath moment, only this Goliath was the entire military establishment, and David's only slingshot was a half-baked theory on a piece of paper. The room itself was designed to intimidate. Around a vast oak table sat the titans of Britain's war effort. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the stoic commander of the RAF's fighter command, the brilliant government scientific advisor, Henry Tizard, and a host of senior intelligence officers whose faces were grim masks of impatience. They looked at the young physicist, barely out of university, with an air of barely concealed annoyance. Jones began, his voice trembling slightly. But as he laid out his evidence, piece by painstaking piece, a change came over him. The nervous academic faded, replaced by a confident scientist presenting undeniable facts. He showed them the photos of the unusual radio from the crashed bomber. He laid out the decoded messages, highlighting the recurring cryptic phrases. He unrolled his hastily drawn diagram showing how two radio beams could intersect over a target. "Gentlemen," he explained, his voice now steady and clear. "Imagine two radio transmitters in Germany, each broadcasting a narrow beam. A German bomber simply flies along the first beam, the guide beam, until their equipment detects the second cross beam. At that precise moment, they know they are directly over the target. They don't need to see a thing. The weather doesn't matter. The darkness doesn't matter. The beams tell them exactly where they are." "Preposterous!" a senior air marshal interrupted, slamming his hand lightly on the table. "Radio waves don't work that way, son. They spread out, they diffuse. You can't create a focused beam like a searchlight over hundreds of miles." But Henry Tizard, the scientist, leaned forward, his eyes glinting with interest. He saw the physics behind the theory. "Actually, Air Marshal," he said calmly, "with the right frequency and antenna design, it is theoretically possible." He turned his sharp gaze to Jones. "Dr. Jones, this is a fascinating theory. But what actual proof do you have that the Germans have built such a system?" This was the moment. Jones took a deep breath. This was his ace in the hole. "We have a German pilot," he said, letting the words hang in the silent room. "Shot down last month. During a routine interrogation, he inadvertently mentioned his training on a beam flying system. He caught himself immediately and clammed up, but it was too late. He said it. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. This wasn't theory anymore. This was a human source confirming the existence of the weapon. Jones pressed his advantage, his voice filled with an urgency that bordered on desperation. I need resources. I need aircraft fitted with sensitive radio receivers to hunt for these beams. I need technical specialists to analyze whatever we find. And I need permission to start developing countermeasures immediately. Because, gentlemen, if I'm right, these beams are already painting targets on our cities. The Germans could use them tonight. The room was utterly silent. Finally, Sir Hugh Dowding, the man in charge, broke the silence. He looked Jones squarely in the eye for a long moment, weighing the man and his incredible story. Dr. Jones, he said, his voice a low rumble. If you are wrong about this, you will be wasting valuable time and resources we desperately need elsewhere. He paused, letting the weight of the warning sink in. But if you are right, the unspoken words filled the room. Every British city is at risk. You have your resources, Dowding concluded. Don't waste them. Within hours, Jones had assembled a small, hand-picked team of scientists and radio specialists, a group of brilliant misfits like himself. Their mission was simple and seemingly impossible: find Hitler's invisible beams. They worked out of a makeshift headquarters, fueled by adrenaline and a constant supply of tea. Modified RAF aircraft flew relentless search patterns across England, their specialized receivers scanning every possible frequency. For 3 agonizing days, they found nothing. Jones's critics in the military grew louder. We're wasting precious fuel on a ghost hunt, one general complained. The pressure on Jones was immense. His career, and more importantly, the fate of Britain's cities, rested on him being right. Then, on the 4th night, everything changed. In the cockpit of a lone Anson aircraft flying near Derby, a radio operator suddenly shouted into his headset. A signal. It was faint at first, then stronger. A steady, narrow radio beam, precisely aimed, originating from somewhere in German-occupied Europe and passing directly over the industrial heart of the city. Within hours, they found another. And another. Each one a silent, invisible arrow pointed at a British factory, a shipyard, a population centre. Jones had been right. The ghosts were real. With concrete proof, Jones and his team worked feverishly to dissect the system. They gave it its code name, Knickerbein, the crooked leg from the intercepted messages, and the more they learned, the more they admired its deadly genius. Look at this, Jones explained to his team, pointing at the flickering green line on an oscilloscope. The beam isn't uniform. The Germans split it into 2 overlapping lobes. On the left side of the beam, the pilot's headset plays Morse code dots. On the right side, it plays dashes. But if you fly exactly down the center, the dots and dashes merge into a perfect continuous tone. Charles Frank stared, a look of awe on his face. It's like audio guardrails for the sky, he murmured. Simple enough for any pilot to follow, but accurate to within a few hundred yards over hundreds of miles. But understanding the weapon was only half the battle. Now, they had to stop it. The first instinct was to just jam it, blast the frequency with so much noise that the German pilots couldn't hear their signal. We can't do that, Jones argued in a late-night meeting with Dowding. That would be like shouting, "We're onto you," across the English Channel. The Germans would know we've figured it out and they'd simply switch to a different system. We have to be smarter. We have to be subtle. Jones's strategy was one of deception, not brute force. We won't block their beams, he explained. We'll confuse them. We'll build our own transmitters and send out signals that mimic the German dashes. To the German pilot, it will sound like he's drifted off course to the right, so he'll correct to the left, flying away from the true center of the beam. He'll think his equipment is malfunctioning, but he won't know why. It was a brilliant piece of electronic trickery. They called the technique meccaning, a portmanteau of masking beacon. Across Britain, secret transmitters were built. The first true test came on a cloudy night in June 1940. Intelligence reported that German bombers were heading for a munitions factory in the Midlands, guided by a Knickerbein beam. As they approached, the British Meekening stations came to life. In the cockpits of the German Heinkels, chaos ensued. The steady tone they were following suddenly became a confusing mess of dots and dashes. Unsure of their true position, they dropped their bombs where they thought the target was. Back in his office, Jones waited, listening to the reports as they trickled in. Then, the call came. No damage to the factory. No casualties. The bombs had fallen harmlessly in an empty field, 5 miles off target. It had worked. For the first time, they had fought back in the invisible war and won. But as Jones looked at the map, at the dozens of other beams they had now identified, he knew this was just the opening skirmish. The Germans were brilliant, and they wouldn't be fooled for long. The invisible war of beams and countermeasures was about to escalate dramatically. Just as the British began to feel they had the upper hand, Jones's deep-seated paranoia paid off. He knew the Germans were too resourceful, too brilliant, to be defeated by a single trick, and deep within the river of decoded German signals, his team found the proof. There were references to a new system, something codenamed X-Gerät, the X device. And this one was a quantum leap forward. Unlike Knickerbein's simple dot-dash guide, X-Gerät was a masterpiece of German engineering. A bomber would fly along a main guide beam, but it would then cross a sequence of 3 different, precisely timed crossbeams. The first alerted the pilot to prepare. The second started an automatic clock on board the aircraft. The third stopped it. The system then instantly calculated the bomber's speed and ground position, and automatically released the bombs at the exact moment required to hit a target the size of a single building. "It's automated," Jones explained to his superiors, his face pale, the diagrams he'd drawn spread across the table. "The pilot doesn't even make the final decision, the machine does it for them. It's accurate to within tens of yards, not hundreds. And it's far harder to jam because it uses multiple frequencies and more complex signals." The intelligence was chillingly specific. This system was so secret, so valuable, that it was reserved for only the most elite Luftwaffe unit. Kampfgruppe 100. They were Hitler's surgical strike team, and X-Gerät was their scalpel. The invisible war had a new, deadlier front. Jones and his team were thrown into a desperate race against time. They worked with barely any sleep, analyzing every scrap of data, every garbled transmission. The breakthrough came from a stroke of luck that felt more like a curse. A German bomber from the elite Kampfgruppe 100 was shot down. Inside the wreckage, a technician found a charred but partially readable technical manual. It contained specifications for the X-Gerät's airborne receiver. With this new information, Jones could calculate the exact frequencies the system used. He could see its inner workings. But this knowledge brought with it a new kind of terror. They now understood the weapon perfectly. And they knew it was already operational. On November 12, 1940, the nightmare became a reality. Jones was summoned to an emergency meeting at the War Cabinet Rooms beneath Whitehall. The air was thick with tension. Codebreakers had intercepted German signals, indicating a massive raid was imminent, scheduled for the night of November 14th. The operation's codename was Mondscheinsonate, Operation Moonlight Sonata. By tracking the newly discovered X-Gerät beams, British intelligence knew the target with horrifying certainty. Coventry. A critical industrial city, packed with aircraft factories and munitions works, the heart of Britain's war production. "We have 48 hours, Jones said, his voice strained from exhaustion. "We can try to jam X-Gerät, but our current systems are crude. It won't be perfect. We can evacuate the city. We can concentrate every fighter and anti-aircraft gun we have." He paused, looking into the eyes of the men who would make the decision. "But gentlemen, we have to decide how much we reveal of what we know." And in that moment, the room was plunged into the terrible arithmetic of war. A brutal, agonizing moral dilemma. If they ordered a mass evacuation of Coventry, moved every available anti-aircraft gun to surround the city, and jammed the German beams with overwhelming force, the Germans would know, without a doubt, that their most secret system, eccentric, had been compromised. They would abandon it and develop something new, plunging British intelligence back into darkness. The advantage would be lost, and dozens of other cities would be vulnerable in the future. But if they did nothing, or did too little, thousands of innocent people in Coventry would die. The debate was heated and painful. One general argued for a full defence, roaring that they could not stand by and sacrifice British citizens. Another, an intelligence chief, argued with cold logic that revealing their hand now would be a catastrophic mistake, costing far more lives in the long run. The decision fell to Prime Minister Winston Churchill. After being briefed on the impossible choices, a compromise was reached. They would deploy some countermeasures, just enough to disrupt the raid but not enough to make the Germans certain their system was broken. They would alert the city's authorities to prepare for a heavy raid, activate fire brigades and medical services, but they would not order a mass evacuation that would scream foreknowledge. They would sacrifice the city to save the secret. Jones felt physically sick. He understood the ice-cold logic of the decision. In the grand strategy of a world war, it was the correct move, but it meant that people, men, women, and children who could have been saved were going to die. This was the true cost of intelligence, knowing the future, but being powerless to fully prevent the tragedy it held. On the night of November 14th, 1940, the sirens over Coventry began their mournful wail. Soon after, the drone of over 500 German bombers filled the sky. For 11 hours, the city was pounded. The British jammers did have an effect. Some of the eccentric beams were bent, causing streams of bombs to fall on the outskirts of the city instead of the factories. But many, far too many, got through. The city burned. The magnificent 14th-century cathedral was reduced to a hollow, smoking shell. The heart of Coventry was ripped out. Hundreds were killed, thousands more were injured. From his London office, Jones listened to the reports coming in throughout the night. Every update, every new casualty number, felt like a personal failure. He knew, rationally, that his work had likely saved many lives, that without his partial countermeasures, the destruction would have been absolute. But that logic offered no comfort. A few days later, Jones walked through the ruins of Coventry with a technical team. The air still smelled of ash and death. He was there to document bomb patterns, to see how effective their jamming had been. Surrounded by the skeletons of buildings and piles of rubble that were once homes, the cold academic nature of his work felt like a mockery. He was jotting notes on a clipboard when an elderly woman, covered in dust, methodically picking through the wreckage of what was once her house, looked up at him. Her eyes were empty of tears, filled with a profound, weary anger. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice raspy. Jones, the brilliant physicist who could speak with confidence to generals, was at a loss for words. He looked at his clipboard, then back at her. We're trying to make sure this doesn't happen again." She held his gaze for a long moment, the silence broken only by the crunch of rubble underfoot. Then she gave a single sharp nod. "Then make sure it bloody well doesn't." That woman's words haunted Jones for the rest of his life. The invisible war had become brutally, painfully visible. Every calculation, every signal analysis, had a human consequence. The weight of Coventry settled upon his shoulders, a burden that would drive him not just to counter the Germans, but to utterly defeat them in their own invisible game. Jamming wasn't enough. He had to find a way to make their weapons completely useless. The ashes of Coventry had barely cooled when Dr. R.V. Jones came to a stark realization. The encounter with the old woman amidst the ruins had solidified a new, cold resolve in him. Their strategy of simply reacting, of patching the holes in Britain's defence as the Germans punched them, was a fool's game. It was like trying to patch a leaking dam with chewing gum. Even when they succeeded, people still died. Jamming wasn't enough. He had to go on the offensive. He had to get ahead of the Germans, to understand their next move before they even made it. He had to become a master of the invisible war, not just a participant. This shift in strategy required more firepower, brainpower. Jones's small team was brilliant, but he needed more. He began a collaboration with one of the greatest scientific minds in Britain, Robert Watson Watt, the man widely considered the father of radar. Together, they weren't just building jammers anymore. They were designing weapons. They were engineering highly directional antennas, specifically designed to create counter beams that could perfectly overlap and neutralize the German signals with surgical precision. It was no longer about making noise. It was about creating a targeted, weaponized silence. And just as their new, aggressive approach was taking shape, Jones's worst fears were confirmed. In the whispers of decoded intelligence from early 1941, a new codename appeared: Wotan. In mythology, Wotan was a one-eyed god who could see everything. Jones immediately understood the terrifying implication. A single beam system, more sophisticated than anything that had come before. The system, technically designated Y-Garret, was revolutionary. It didn't need multiple crossbeams. It used just one, highly precise beam. But here was the terrifying genius of it. It was a two-way system. The ground station sent a signal to the bomber, and a special device on the aircraft, a transponder, would immediately send a signal back. By measuring the tiny delay between the outgoing and incoming signals, the system could calculate the bomber's exact distance along the beam, continuously, down to the yard. Think about it like a bat using sonar. It was elegant, it was precise, and it was a nightmare. Jones explained the problem to Churchill in a private, late-night briefing. With Königstein and eccentric, their systems were a monologue. They were shouting instructions into the void. We could whisper in their ear and confuse them. But Wotan is a conversation. The ground station talks to the bomber, and the bomber talks back. If we try to jam it, Jones paused, letting the severity sink in. It would be like shouting over them in the middle of their sentence. They would know instantly that we're listening and that we understand. Churchill, a cloud of cigar smoke swirling around his head, studied the young physicist. So we cannot blind them, and we cannot deafen them. What do you propose, Dr. Jones? Jones took a breath. What he was about to suggest was audacious, bordering on insane. Deception, Prime Minister. We don't jam their signals. Instead, we answer them. Churchill's eyebrows raised. We build our own transponders on the ground, Jones continued, his voice gaining momentum. When the German ground station asks the bomber, "Where are you?" our system will intercept that question, and before the real bomber can reply, we'll shout back an answer first, feeding them false information. We'll make them think their bomber is miles away from where it actually is. We will speak to the German bombers in their own language, and we will lie to them. A slow smile spread across Churchill's grim face. You're proposing we become a ghost in their machine. I approve. Make it happen. The technical challenge was immense. Jones and his team had to build a device that could perfectly mimic the German transponder. Without ever having seen one, they had to reverse engineer it from nothing but the faint, fleeting signals they could intercept from the air. It was like trying to build a perfect replica of a car, having only heard its engine for a few seconds as it drove past in the dark. Dr. Robert Cockburn, another brilliant electronic warfare specialist, joined the effort. Together, they designed what they called a masking beacon, codenamed Aspirin, for the headache it was intended to give the Germans. It was a ground station designed for one purpose: to lie. The system was a masterpiece of electronic subterfuge. It would detect the incoming Wotan signal from Germany, instantly analyze it, and broadcast a fake response signal that was stronger and faster than the real bombers. To the German ground controllers, their equipment would appear to work perfectly. The numbers on their screens would make sense, but in reality, they would be tracking a phantom, guiding their bombers towards coordinates that Jones and his team had invented, coordinates that led to nothing but empty fields or the cold, dark waters of the English Channel. The night of the first operational test was nerve-wracking. Every scientist involved knew that if they got the timing wrong by even a microsecond, the deception would fail and the secret would be out. Intelligence indicated a Wotan-equipped bomber was on its way, targeting a critical naval base on the south coast. As the German aircraft crossed into British airspace, the aspirin beacons were activated. On the ground, Jones and his team could only wait, monitoring the radio frequencies in dead silence. They tracked the bomber as it flew confidently towards its target. They saw it reach the calculated release point, the false release point they had fed it. And then they heard the reports from observers near the real target. The naval base. Nothing. Silence. The bomber had passed overhead and disappeared. The next morning, reconnaissance photos confirmed it. A neat pattern of bomb craters was found, 5 miles out to sea. The German bomber, believing its state-of-the-art system was working flawlessly, had dropped its entire payload of high explosives on a patch of empty water. The naval base was untouched. In the days and weeks that followed, the story repeated itself. More Wartime-guided attacks were misdirected with comical precision. One raid, aimed at a factory, ended up bombing a swamp. Another dropped its bombs in the middle of a forest. The German high command was in chaos. The Wotan system, their most advanced technology, the one they believed was infallible, seemed to be cursed. They blamed their pilots for incompetence. They tore apart the equipment, recalibrating it endlessly. But the problem persisted. They never figured it out. The deception was too perfect. They eventually lost faith in their own technology, reducing their reliance on Wotan and attributing its bizarre failures to atmospheric interference and technical unreliability. Jones and his team had achieved the ultimate victory in the invisible war. They hadn't just jammed a signal. They had hacked the enemy's entire system. They had turned the Germans' greatest technological advantage into a crippling liability, a source of confusion and self-doubt. By mid-1941, the German night-bombing campaign, which had once threatened to bring Britain to its knees, had been effectively broken. A small team of scientists, armed with physics and an audacious plan to lie, had won a decisive battle without firing a single shot. But in the process of analyzing all this German technology, Jones was about to stumble upon something else. A secret that went far beyond radio beams. A secret that would lead him to Hitler's most dangerous weapon of all. By 1943, R.V. Jones had become the ghost in Germany's war machine. His mastery of the invisible spectrum had saved countless lives, but his work was far from over. In his obsessive quest to understand every facet of German technology, he began to notice a pattern. In the background noise of intelligence reports, in decoded messages, and in the interrogations of high-level prisoners, a single, strange name kept surfacing: Peenemünde. It was a remote village on Germany's Baltic coast. The references were cryptic, speaking of advanced propulsion, long-range bombardment, and retaliation weapons. At first, Jones suspected it was a new, more advanced research center for beam guidance systems. But the fragments he was collecting didn't quite fit. Then, in early 1943, a piece of intelligence landed on his desk that changed everything. A photograph, taken by a member of the Danish resistance, showed a drawing of a strange, missile-like object. It was massive, far larger than any conventional rocket. Jones felt that same cold dread he'd felt when he first read about the X-Gerät. This wasn't a bomb guided by a beam. This was a pilotless, ballistic missile, capable of carrying a ton of high explosives at supersonic speeds. A weapon that could fly from Germany to London in under 5 minutes. A weapon against which there was no defense. No fighter could catch it. No anti-aircraft gun could hit it. Once again, he faced a wall of skepticism. Rockets? Scoffed one general, echoing the disbelief of years past. This is the stuff of comic books, Dr. Jones, not serious military technology. But Jones had learned his lesson. He knew that the most dangerous threats were the ones that seemed impossible. He relentlessly pushed for reconnaissance flights over the mysterious Peenemünde facility. Finally, the RAF sent their photo reconnaissance Spitfires. When the pictures came back, the analysts were stunned. There, on the remote coastline, was a massive industrial complex, and on the test stands, clear as day, were the very same rocket-like objects from the resistance drawing. The discovery triggered immediate action. On the night of August 17th, 1943, the RAF launched Operation Hydra, a massive bombing raid involving nearly 600 heavy bombers. Their target was Peenemünde. The raid was costly, 40 bombers were lost, but it was a devastating blow to Hitler's V-weapons program. Key scientists and engineers were killed, workshops were destroyed, and the development of the V-2 rocket was set back by critical months. The V-2 seconds that eventually rained down on London were fewer in number and came later than planned, a direct result of the intelligence Jones had championed. But here is where the story takes its final, shocking turn. Here is the secret that lies beneath all the other secrets, the discovery that, even to Jones, would only become clear in the full light of history after the war. The scientists at Peenemünde weren't just working on rockets. The facility was a hub, a critical intersection point for Germany's most advanced and terrifying research, and documents recovered after the war would reveal a horrifying truth. The German nuclear weapons program, the race to build an atomic bomb, was deeply intertwined with the work being done at places like Peenemünde. The same scientists, the same supply chains, the same high-level oversight. Think about that for a moment. A 8-year-old physicist, chasing a crazy theory about invisible radio beams, managed to convince his government to counter them. That success led him to uncover a secret rocket program, and the subsequent bombing of that rocket facility inadvertently dealt a blow to the development of a Nazi atomic bomb. Had the Peenemünde program continued unimpeded, had Jones never connected those obscure dots, Hitler might well have held the world hostage with nuclear weapons. One man's curiosity, beginning with a strange antenna, had set off a chain reaction that may have saved civilization itself. When the war finally ended, Reginald Jones was still only 33 years old. His work remained one of Britain's most closely guarded secrets, the foundation for a new age of electronic warfare. He quietly returned to academic life, never seeking fame or recognition. When the story was finally declassified decades later, he was knighted by the Queen, but he always gave credit to his team, the brilliant men and women who fought the invisible war alongside him. But his legacy is undeniable. The principles he pioneered are now fundamental to military operations and even civilian technology around the world. Every time you use GPS, you are benefiting from the science of precisely timed radio signals that Jones mastered. But more than that, Jones proved something profound. He proved that intelligence, creativity, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom could be more powerful than any weapon. Hitler's biggest secret wasn't the Knickerbein beam, or the X-Gerät, or even the V-2 rocket. His biggest secret was the myth of Germany's unstoppable technological superiority, and it was a 8-year-old British physicist, a quiet academic who was laughed at by generals, who ultimately exposed that myth for what it was: an illusion. He was the ghost in the machine who proved that the most powerful weapon in any war is the human mind. And that brings us back to that terrible choice at Coventry. The decision to sacrifice a city to protect a secret that would save many more. It's one of the most haunting moral dilemmas of the entire war. So we want to ask you, what would you have done? Is it right to make that cold, calculated choice? Put yourself in that room with Churchill and Jones. Let us know what you would have decided in the comments below. Your conversations are what keep these vital stories and their difficult lessons alive.